Once upon a time, there was a man who became pregnant by an idea. It was not a particularly great idea, and in fact, not even the kind of idea that would be worth communicating to you. It was more like a collection of other people's ideas, gathered in a jumble, which he presumed were his own ideas. But this was not what was interesting about him. What made his idea important was not the idea he had himself, but his idea about the way to spread that idea. What this man had invented was the first printing press. Nobody even had written language at that point, but after a painstaking effort to set up educational colleges, which people could be only persuaded of at the barrel of a gun, enough literacy spread that people were able to understand the broadsheets that he disseminated. Then, realizing how asinine his conclusions were, they burnt him on a pyre of paper with the hope that his bad ideas would die with him. Instead, the crowd watched as the searing smoke entered his lungs, and the inventor managed, holding his arm out dramatically in a gesture of accusation, to cough out one last curse, and then, giving up the ghost, died with a smile on his face. At this point, the people felt guilty, and the inheritors of the printing presses, being the only people who had the ability to organize a mass media campaign, complained vociferously about his mistreatment, convincing people that his death had been an outrage, and that really, despite being an idiot, he should have been honored for his mechanical innovations, and that furthermore, as a wicked and low and wretched collection of sinners, it would contribute greatly to the improvement of their souls if, rather than leaving the inventor's skeletonized corpse out to gather cobwebs and dust in the city crypt as they had been doing, they took out his body and placed it on a pedestal in the city as if it were a statue of one of their heroes. The people obeyed, and the inheritors of the printing press, amazed at their success in influencing the people, drank deep into the night to celebrate. One of them, Arthur, on his sixth beer, his breath fogging out of his mouth like the faint luminous fog that hung across the street lamps and gave a cool and clammy texture to the city, remarked to his compatriot that a marvelous success portended riches, and was to be credited to the exhilarating feeling of freedom that had inspired him to write words, paragraphs, and polemical turns of phrase that he had not thought hitherto possible for one such as him. His compatriot agreed, and, arm in arm, they walked caroling all the way home, the cold fangs of frost unable to penetrate their bubble of vainglorious victory. The sense of accomplishment did not last. Although Arthur, closing the door to his apartment after having sent his friend off packing so he could gloat and goon alone, his trousers already halfway off, thought it impossible that anything could burst his buoyant bubble, he was proven wrong by the most peculiar sight that made him stand up stiff as a statue, his pants sliding all the way to his feet as he stood in his boxers in front of a most unusual sight. The corpse of the inventor stood before him, with a horribly grinning face fixed in the rictus of death, the charred and blackened skin stretched grotesquely across its chaps. Arthur almost fainted and clutched the counter for support. "What do you want?" Arthur questioned, his voice trembling. The creature grinned and, sticking out its hand, stuck his finger to Arthur's forehead. Arthur fainted, and while passed out, dreamed horrible dreams of creatures with 5 legs and 7 noses feasting on collections of carrion. It seemed somehow offensive and yet inoffensive, and lulled him into a feeling of imperceptible commodiousness, so that when he woke up, he had entirely forgotten about the encounter he had had with the zombie, and put it down to a hazy memory from a night of drinking and a bad dream. He vowed to be more careful of his body in the future, and, after drinking a cup of tea, wrapped his scarf and coat around himself and headed off to the office. When he got to the office, everything was in a tumult. People were running around like chickens with their heads cut off. Nobody had come up with a system for how to organize marketing requests, and everybody and their mother was throwing bowls of rolled-up paper with requests for what they wanted to see printed through the windows. A fruit seller wanted to complain about his rival's strawberries. An iron magnate wanted to advertise the quality of his steel. Political radicals wanted to march on and burn down the king's palace. The king's advisor wanted to imprison them. The volume was so much that the building itself became flooded with paper and, after someone tried lighting a cigarette, had to be evacuated. The fire department arrived but was unable to stop the blaze from consuming the printing presses, which, when the publishers and the gawking crowd of spectators re-entered, had all vanished, presumably burnt to a crisp, with their ashes indistinguishable from the various dregs of hopes and dreams all gone up in smoke. Publishers tried to convince the people to rebuild the printing presses, but without the printing presses, weren't able to change anyone's mind, and the art of printing, as well as literacy, was eventually irrecoverably lost. By the time Arthur, who had been the youngest of the printers, was old and gray, he was the only one who knew how to read and was viewed as something of a local oddity, cursed by association with that satanic art. He didn't mind, as the isolation gave him a chance to sit and speculate on the world that could have been. It was on one of those cold and wintry days, when everyone was inside celebrating Christmas festivities, that Arthur, old and alone, sat on a bench in the street, waiting for death to come upon him. He had felt the specter hovering near for ages and ages now, but now, after having watched a family divide the turkey between themselves equitably, and having seen the smiling and laughing as the father hugged his daughter who had arrived late with her boyfriend, he unbuttoned his coat and decided to die then and there. Perhaps they would see him sitting on the bench and feel pity for him. Perhaps not. Either way, he would pass on from this life and, in being found for dead, at least imprint his memory on the mind of whoever happened to find him as a case of ultimate pity. What instead happened was he heard a noise come from a manhole nearby. Intrigued, he sat up and rebuttoned his coat. giving up on his suicidal ideas for just a moment. The manhole cover nearest to him was buckling as a stream of soft thuds so infinitely fast that they merged into one deafening roar sounded from it. Arthur walked over curiously and, seeing the corner of a piece of paper sticking out from it, jumped for joy and with superhuman strength heaved the cover off the manhole. What happened next doomed humanity. Thousands and thousands of letters flew upwards, addressed to every human, animal, plant, microbe, spot, and atom of Earth. They flew upwards endlessly, burning the city, then the country, then the continent, then the globe. Some countries tried burning the paper, but the resulting ash formed storm clouds in the sky and blocked out the sun. The plants died, animal carcasses rotted in the street, millions killed themselves, and billions starved. Arthur, living off the joy of reading so many printed things, trudged on. Although eventually he too became bored and, giving up on life, decided to trudge back to the same spot where the envelopes, now pouring out the rate of 1,000,000 per minute, shot out of the manhole. He again lay down to die among, but he could not die. Try as he might, his body refused to quit. Instead, he felt a strange premonition, like fish wire in his chest drawing him forward, that there was something he must go and see before he died. He plunged off through the vast Antarctic drifts of letters. Like a mouse he burrowed, threading a threadless way from blank to blank until, stepping over the exact spot where an open manhole had been being worked on when the explosion first began, he fell down into the sewers. The sewers were packed with mail and hard to navigate, but, gnawing his way through it like a rat, he crawled closer and closer to the source of the noise, and, climbing over the dead bodies of previous pilgrims and attempted assassins, fell down out of the paper haze into a circular, empty chamber about 20 feet wide in any direction. Here he saw the last remaining printing press in the world, and the old desiccated skeleton of the inventor, his face still fixed in a horrible grin. He raised a pistol he had stolen from a failed assassin and shot at him, but this did nothing. You cannot kill the dead, he thought to himself as he walked slowly up to this figured zombie. The zombie looked at him and laughed, and, stretching his arms and running his hands over his joints, walked up and clapped a hand on Arthur's shoulders like an old chum. "So you found me at last," the skeleton said, the noise vibrating out of its open windpipe. "Do you like what I've done with the place?" "Why did you do this?" asked Arthur plaintively. "Why do you think?" replied the skeleton acerbically. "I'm sorry. Can you please forgive us?" "Forgive you for what?" "For killing you, for not saving you, for mistreating you. Please leave this body and go in peace to the next world." "I cannot," said the skeleton, who sat back down and, pulling out a newspaper, began to read, mouthing to itself gruesomely. "Humanity will die," objected Arthur. "Of course they will. Why shouldn't they? They don't all deserve it. The crimes of the few outweigh the good of the many. Such is the way it is. One jot of corruption pollutes an entire puddle," the skeleton snapped sardonically. At this, Arthur, at his wit's end, shot the skeleton with as many bullets as he had left. Nothing, and Arthur, exhausted, staggered up to the printing press, hoping to, with the last of his strength, to destroy it. The skeleton, which had been sitting absent-mindedly until then, stood up with an expression of anger and charged at him furiously, screaming about his vengeance. Arthur, too tired to mount a response, simply fell backwards into the printing press and, taken and twisted by its gears, was chewed up and spit into 1,000,000 tiny pieces all over the globe. Where these pieces landed, flowers sprang up, which, in a 1,000,000-year process, turned into trees, by which point the rats and rodents had turned the paper into mulch, and the world, although devoid of humans, was habitable again. Fruit blossomed on the trees, in which new humans, stranger and more terrible, were born, being dropped one by one onto the new earth, slowly lowered by a parachute of leaves. Landing first on the old city where the inventor had been slain, they built a garden over the ancient remains of it, now dirt and mulch himself, and found that strange plants with unique squiggles and leaves grew out of them. The squiggles said, in a language nobody understood, or even understood to be language, "What a pity so much, and yet so little has been said." But, as nobody understood them, nobody took any notice of these plants except to note that, when dried and smoked through a pipe, they produced an exhilarating but paranoid sensation, and so that plot of land, viewed as a danger to public health, was salted and made to remain fallow, the people building around it a city where they lived happily ever after. They grew to be so plentiful and prosperous that one day, one of them, a man, possessed of a terrible idea, even invented printing. Did you like that short story? Do you want to see more things like it? Check out my book, Pre-Modernism, now available on Amazon. Check out the link in the description. It's got interdimensional communist salamanders, Protestant newspaper robber barons, and transgender tradwives. If you want to support this channel, please consider buying it.